Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me okay? Is that loud enough in the back? It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming. I hope this talk is a little bit different. My hope today is to try to demystify some of the ideas that we have about the media and what the media cares about, how the media approaches public health issues, and hopefully you'll walk away with a couple practical tips about how to engage with media and particularly how to get the media to care about things that you care about as a public health researcher. So I thought I would just start by apologizing. I know recently you've had some very high-profile speakers. Laura Darcy was here in September, so I just want you to know that I have no royal titles. I have not pioneered any breakthrough clinical advances, and I have certainly not overhauled a national health system, so I apologize if you were expecting better. However, I was for several years a member of the fake news media, as the current president of my country would call it. So I did work for several years as a journalist, and I spent much of that time reporting on health reform and health policy. And during that time, I was actually covering the passage of Obamacare. Some of you may be familiar with it. This was the U.S. effort to expand health insurance coverage. And when I was working as a reporter, I saw a lot of good reporting, but also a lot of bad reporting. So on the good side, there were a lot of newspapers and a lot of reporters who were really trying to cover the complexity of health reform and health policy and really going into some of the weeds and the details. But there was also a lot of bad reporting. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with this death panels concept, but there was a attack on Obamacare because people said that they were trying to kill elderly individuals by providing them with end-of-life counseling. And so there were these memes that would get propagated. And there was also just a lot of focus on politicians fighting with each other. So rather than focusing on the substance of the policy or the actual research, a lot of the focus was on disagreements among politicians. And so even though I've left journalism and I'm now a doctor with a public health background, I'm still very interested in a lot of the questions that I saw when I was a journalist. And I think one of those big questions is, as public health people, how do we get the media to care about what we do? So I think if you look at this diagram, we will spend most of our time in the bubble on the far side. We collect data, we do our research, we do the statistical analyses, hopefully we publish it, and then I think we hope that there's an impact somehow on either government or on the communities that will be influenced by the research. And what I would argue is that there's actually a sort of a missing link there, which is the role of the media, both traditional media as well as more recently the role of social media. So how is the information, the research that we do and produced, how does that get picked up by the media, interpreted, maybe misinterpreted, and then how does that ultimately affect what policymakers do and what communities do? And so for me this matters because I think on one hand the media has tremendous power to do good. It when you think about it, it dictates what we think about issues. It sort of sets the agenda, so what we talk about. It also frames how we think about things, how we think about issues related to public health. But media also has the power to do not good. And so I think, as all of us are consumers of media, we know that the media is prone to sensationalizing stories, making them more severe, more extreme than they actually are, prone to inaccuracy, so sometimes reporters get things wrong. And I think the third point here is one that a lot of us probably care about in public health, that we feel like there are things that we care about, that we research, that will never get picked up by the media. And so how do we overcome that challenge? And so what I want to talk about over the next 20 minutes, 30 minutes or so, four key points. One is, how does the media cover public health? I want to go a little bit into media theory just to explain sort of when we say something is newsworthy, what does it even mean? Why is something deemed worthy of being written about and something else is ignored? So who decides and how do we make those decisions? Then I wanted to go a little deeper into how journalists think and how journalists make decisions about what they report on, and then hopefully conclude with a few practical tips. So I did, before I start, just give you one caveat. So obviously I'm American, and my understanding of media is very much rooted in what I consume in the U.S. And, for the most part, I think American media is decent, but it also has a lot of flaws. And certainly there are other people in the U.S. who think that there are major problems with the media. And so, I'm very much rooted in what I know, and I'm less familiar with the media here, as well as the media in some of your own home countries. And so one thing I'd really like to hear as we go forward, and maybe at the end, is how much of what I'm saying right now feels relevant for Armenia, how much of it feels relevant for people coming from other countries, to the extent that it's different from where you live versus what I'm describing. Because media is a very culturally influenced entity. So I thought I would start with a kind of a high-level macro view and just take a public health topic and talk about how it gets covered. And so this is actually an article that came out last month by a group of researchers from India, and they were concerned about the topic of air pollution in India, and they noted that India has more than half of the most polluted cities in the world in terms of air pollution, and that media coverage in India plays a critical role in influencing policy. So what is the media actually doing in terms of covering this issue, and what do they cover, what do they ignore? So they looked through about 6,000 articles over the past 2 years and ended up coding about 500 of them. And what they found is, just from a first blush, when they looked at different categories of topics, they found that some things really get a lot of attention. So number one was the extent of air pollution. Basically, how bad is the problem? What is the magnitude of the problem? The second one was the impact. What are the health effects? Who gets hurt by it? Third, you can kind of see, the first two, 28% of the stories covered it, 26%. As we go down, much less coverage. So third was solutions. How do we fix it? At the bottom were things that I think we care a lot about in public health that are much harder to report on. So things like the technical aspects of monitoring air pollution, or even the causes of air pollution. I think we spend a lot of time researching etiology in public health. Either reporters find that boring, they find it too complex. We'll get into that in a little more detail. They also looked at the quality of the stories, and so they found two key things. One is that most of these articles tended to have a negative tone, so it was much easier for reporters to focus on negative things than positive things. So it's easier to talk about how bad a problem is than how responsive policymakers are to fixing that problem. They also noted, and I think this is really interesting, that most of the articles talked about the need for urgent action. So 80% of the article said, this is an urgent problem, it needs to be addressed now. They were much less likely to talk about air pollution as an issue that's been going on for years and gradually getting worse. The framing was much more as an urgent need. And then finally, looking at the actual text of the articles, most of them focused either on a specific city or comparisons between India and other countries. And so the journalists were trying to make the topic relevant to readers by focusing it either locally or by making geographical comparisons. And so this was just one paper, but I thought it kind of illustrated at a high level some of the points that are very salient to journalists and areas, conversely, that get left out. And so if we were to draw an interim conclusion just from this one topic, we would say, a public health problem is more likely to get covered if it speaks to issues like magnitude, impact, negativity, urgency, relevance. But I would say this is only part of the story. And so I would say let's consider another example. So say you're a public health researcher, you're studying drug adherence, and to us this is a huge problem. So you could say 50% of medications for chronic diseases aren't taken as prescribed. So that meets magnitude and impact, right? There are, within this country, hundreds of thousands of people who aren't taking their drugs as they should. In India, you're talking tens of millions of people. Certainly negativity is a huge part of the story. There are huge potential health complications. So if people aren't taking their medicines, depending upon which condition they have, the potential for stroke, amputation, blindness, all those negative things could be emphasized. Urgency, maybe, if people could certainly end up in the hospital with one of these complications. But I would say this story, Ebola, is always going to get more attention than adherence to medication. And why is that? Why is something like the Ebola virus or an outbreak of a disease, even if it's only affecting a handful of people, going to get more coverage than something that affects hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people? And so I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into some media theory, so bear with me for a second. But when people who study the media, when they talk about what makes the news, they often go back to this study from 50 years ago, and it was done by two Norwegian researchers, and they were interested in this idea of why do our newspapers cover some topics but not other topics, and they were particularly looking at a couple of crises going on elsewhere in the world, so in Congo and Cuba and Cyprus. And they ultimately decided on three different areas that really shape why some things get covered and some things don't. So number one was impact. Number two was, does it identify with the audience, with the readership? And number three, which I'll explain more, is this issue of pragmatics of reporting. So was it something that was easy for editors and journalists to wrap their heads around and to get information on? And so impact was the first big category, and they broke impact down into several different levels. So one was threshold. So basically, the more severe or extreme something is, the more people that are affected, the more likely it is to get picked up. So could I just see a show of hands? How many people here are familiar with the cholera outbreak in Yemen? Yeah, not many. So I would say this issue got zero coverage in the US until, I would say the Yemen war in general got zero coverage in US press until cholera broke out this summer. And now, as unfortunately hundreds of thousands of kids have died of cholera, suddenly it met the threshold criteria for coverage in the US media. So before, essentially nothing. And then, within the past couple months, going back to May, finally we started getting some news media, but there was definitely a threshold criteria there. There are a couple other categories which I'll run through quickly, but I think some of these are really relevant for us as public health practitioners. One of them is frequency. So sudden events get much more coverage than gradual events. So when we think about something like climate change, I think that explains why, in part, it's so difficult to report on climate change and to get people interested. This is a gradual process, and even though there are consequences of climate change, like hurricanes that are sudden events, the actual process is gradual, and so it tends to sort of slip under the radar of journalism. Negativity, as I mentioned, bad news is much more exciting than good news, and so we'd rather talk about death and disaster than weddings and charity events. Unexpectedness, things that are out of the ordinary, are inherently more interesting than things that we see every day. And then unambiguity, so something that seems to be a simple and straightforward story is just easier to report and for us to understand than something that's complex. So the second category they mentioned is audience identification. And so basically that's the issue of what does an audience, what does a readership care about? And so the three different areas they highlighted were personalization, meaningfulness, and actually reference to elite nations and celebrities. So personalization meaning, is there a human element to the story? We would much rather read a story, a profile of a person, than read statistical data. Meaningfulness, you can define that in different ways, but usually it has to do with, does the story speak to us from a cultural perspective, a geographical perspective? Is there something about it that we relate to? So I think that's another issue with Yemen and the United States. It's half a world away. Yemen has very few political ramifications for the US, and so it doesn't seem meaningful to most Americans. And then reference to elite nations and celebrities, I find this one interesting. I don't know if this is something that has become more common in our time. It sometimes feels that way, but even back in 1965, when these two Norwegian guys were doing this research, they were talking about sort of this obsession with celebrity and power. And so the example I put up here, how many of you know Angelina Jolie? Most, yeah. So for better or worse, this was sort of the perfect combination of a story that was both personalized and related to a celebrity. So she had a BCRA1 mutation. which carries a very high risk of breast cancer, as many of you know. And so she opted for a prophylactic double mastectomy. And the sheer amount of coverage around her decision actually had a very demonstrable effect on the care that women got. And so after she came public with what was going on and went through this procedure, researchers actually found that the number of women getting prophylactic mastectomies in the US doubled. And it wasn't just in the US, it was in other countries too. So New South Wales was mentioned here. And then finally, the third category, which is a bit harder to I think wrap our heads around initially, is this question of pragmatics of media coverage. And so basically this is getting at, what do journalists and editors find easy to report and what's hard to report? And so if there's a story that is different from what you're expecting it to be as a journalist, you actually have to step back and take much more time to report it, to research it, and that requires resources. Continuity is another big element. A story that's already in the news tends to stay in the news. And so in the US, Hillary Clinton's emails became a story and stayed a story and stayed a story and stayed a story. And I think that's one aspect of pragmatics, where something that has already garnered a large readership continues to have readership. And then composition, basically that's the editor making decisions about which stories he or she thinks is most interesting to a readership. And that's incredibly subjective. So you could say, well, that paper's from 1965, that was 50 some years ago. Media has changed a lot. Is this still relevant today? So I just wanted to quickly update some of those findings. So this was a study that was done 2001 by 2 British researchers. And so they looked at the 3 most popular newspapers in the UK, and they said, what's actually getting covered in these papers? And for the most part, a lot of these categories will look familiar, right? Bad news, sudden things, magnitude, relevance. Interestingly, they found that power, celebrity, and entertainment had zoomed to the top of the list. So, these things were in there before, but by 2001, they had become much more prominent in how information was reported. And so just out of curiosity, I was looking through the Armenian media, at least the English version of it, just doing a search on how is cancer covered in the media here. And I kept coming across all these stories about the Queen of Jordan and her work, and it just struck me as interesting that, at least what I was seeing, that many of them seem to revolve around a celebrity person advocating for a story, as opposed to public health experts advocating for something. So why is it that the media seem to be more interested in what a celebrity had to say? Perhaps we can talk about that. And then you could say, okay, that study I just talked about, that was from 2001. We're now in 2017. Everyone's using social media. Has social media completely changed the way that information is created and distributed, and the way the media reports on things? And so that same group of researchers actually updated their study. They looked at more newspapers, but they also looked at Facebook and Twitter. And interestingly, they found that for the most part, it's still the same. If you look at the left-hand column, that was the ranking back in 2001. On the right side, you see the ranking in 2017. So you can see that things have changed around a little bit. Entertainment is the most likely topic to be spread on social media, but surprising news and bad news are now very prominent. But one other thing they added, they said they found 2 new things with social media. One is this issue of audiovisuals. And so stories that have a strong visual component attached to them are much more likely to garner attention. And whether that's a photo or an infographic, it doesn't really matter what the graphic is, but it's the fact that it's visual rather than just text. And the other new thing they noticed is this concept of shareability. And so we talk about sharing stories with each other. And it's somewhat hard to define what it means for something to be shareable. But an editor from a prominent magazine was quoted as saying, something is shareable if it makes you smile or if it makes you angry. And I think that's a pretty good working definition. If you see something, either if it makes you really happy or if it makes you really angry, you're probably more likely to pass it on to people. And so interestingly enough, the most shared story on Twitter that these researchers found was a story of the trend of Palestinian children who had been killed in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And they noted that there was nothing particularly timely or new about this, but it was the fact that the issue had been put into a graphic form that upset a lot of people, that basically made it catchy on social media. And so if I were to sort of revise that initial conclusion that we talked about, what do newspapers, what do media organizations care about with a story, I would add, we had our initial definition, and then I would add these other elements. So is it personalized? Is there an anecdote to it? Can we think of it as a human interest story? Does it surprise us? Maybe having a celebrity helps. Is there a visual component? And is it shareable? And so I think we're getting closer to a definition, but I wanted to get to the third part, which is to go a little deeper into how journalists actually think about issues, because I think this helps sort of fill out the definition. Journalists think about problems very differently than public health professionals do. And so I wanted to sort of sketch out some of the differences. And this actually comes from a paper that I found, but I agree with all these points from my own personal experience. One is that in public health, we rely very strongly on statistical evidence. This is like the backbone of what we do. Journalists, not so much. Journalism is about anecdotes. It's about storytelling. Statistics are nice because they can support the anecdotal information that you're getting, but they're not the fundamental bedrock of what the story is based around. Two, in public health, we really focus on and rely upon publications. So if you're writing a paper, you're citing what everyone else has cited before you because you want to show that you understand the literature and that your research is based upon that understanding. Journalism, not so much. It's really based upon expert commentary. So trying to draw in knowledgeable people, either policymakers or people in positions of power. Public health experts would be nice, but perhaps not as much as they should be drawn in. But journalism really draws upon the wisdom of experts as opposed to the prior publication record. I think in public health, for the most part, we strive for consensus. I think this is true for a lot of biomedical science as well. That when you're doing research, yes, you're trying to do something different and new, but if it's so far out of line with what the sort of standard practice is or the orthodoxy is, it can be viewed with a lot of skepticism. Whereas journalism is really about controversy. Stories that are about consensus are inherently less interesting, and so it's much easier to write a story about person A versus person B than person A and B agree. And then finally, I think in public health we live in a world that is very complex. We talk about health systems, we talk about systems thinking and all the different components that have to work together. Journalism complexity is very challenging, and I think as a reporter, certainly when you have a limited number of words, you're striving for clarity. And so you're trying to take the complex and boil it down into something that's fairly simple and straightforward. And then on top of that dichotomy, there are also the daily pressures that journalists and editors face. And so many journalists, not all, but many lack technical training. And so like when I started reporting about healthcare, I did not have a formal public health or healthcare background. It was new to me. So I was learning everything that I knew about health essentially on the job. And I would say that's not all that uncommon now. Particularly in the US, I can't speak for other countries, but I think as a lot of magazines and newspapers are having financial trouble, they hire younger people to cover stories because they can pay them less, and younger people by definition have less experience. Journalists are also under a lot of time pressure, and so you may come in the morning and be told that you have to write a story in the next 4 hours, and you have to crank that out. And at times you have a week or 2 weeks to work on a longer story, but journalists are constantly juggling time pressures, and so we may be very critical of an article that we read, but it's I think hard to understand the pressure the journalist was under. And then the third point, and this is something that maybe doesn't get talked about enough are commercial pressures. And so historically, there was a divide between journalists and the advertising side. So the people who made the money for the paper did not influence what the reporters did or the stories they covered. That's sort of collapsed in the past 5 or 10 years. And so increasingly you'll find that, a big company will say, okay, I'll give the paper X amount of money. I'm not telling you to write this story, but we would like some coverage on this topic. And so that happens more than I think most people realize. And it can affect not only whether the story is covered, it can affect the way headlines are written, where articles are actually placed on a newspaper, so if they're buried on the inside or put on the front page. So taking all of that, I would sort of come back to a sort of composite definition, a final definition to say, what actually gets a public health issue covered. Its magnitude, its impact, its negativity, its urgency, its relevance, its personalization with anecdotes, shareable visual in our social media age. Suddenness and controversy matter a lot. And then from a journalist perspective, their own knowledge and their own resources, how much pressure they're under on a day-to-day basis. And so I go through all that to say kind of what can we do as public health people? I think we can do better appreciating what is newsworthy. We often care very strongly about the work we do and the research we do. That doesn't necessarily mean other people care about it as well. And there are going to be some stories that don't get picked up because they're just not deemed as interesting. But I think I hope it's helpful to sort of reflect on a lot of these points that I've belabored about what the media finds interesting and what journalists find interesting, to think about how do we frame what we do in a way that if you are trying to get media organizations interested, speak to them in their language. So don't send them something that's heavy in statistics and technical jargon when you could have visuals and have anecdotes and have simple language. And some of these may sound like common sense points, but I think it's almost viewed in a dismissive way sometimes in academia, that we go through all this education to learn how to speak in a more technical way, and then we almost feel like it's beneath us to speak in a common language to the media. We get excited about p-values. P-values are less interesting to journalists, and so I think tailoring our message is very, very important. And so I wanted to leave you with 5 or 6 key tips, which hopefully can help with you as you go through your education and become public health experts, and to think about how to tailor that message. So tip 1 is to read regular health articles critically. When we're in school, we talk a lot about reading journals, but I think reading newspapers, online news, watching health coverage on TV is just as important, because we need to critique how the media covers public health topics. So I would say be a critical and savvy consumer of regular news media. Consider what was covered and what wasn't covered. Consider why some stories got attention and why others didn't. Which newsworthy elements did the story include? So if you happen to see tomorrow a story about cancer prevalence in Armenia, why did that story get picked up? Was it because it happened to be World Cancer Day and there was a news peg for it? Was it because the president's wife said something and there was a celebrity power angle to it? I think picking up on those things can be really helpful for us in terms of better understanding why some things get traction. 2, so I would actually encourage you all to contact reporters, both when you think they've gotten something right and when you think they've gotten something wrong. The picture I put up here, I put up here for a reason, and that's to say this is not how most interactions with reporters go. It's usually not someone standing with a microphone in your face taping you on camera. Most of the times when I was working as a journalist, I was sitting behind my desk. I would call people up on the phone. Most of the conversations were on what we call background, so I wasn't even quoting anyone. I was just trying to learn information to better understand myself. And I would say as a reporter who was just learning the field, hearing from people who were experts was incredibly helpful. And I would say everybody in this room is already an expert in something within public health. You probably don't think that, but whatever you're studying for your master's thesis or your dissertation, you know more about that topic than 99.9% of people out there. Certainly more than what a health reporter knows. And so I think you have an opportunity to educate reporters, and most reporters, particularly ones who cover health regularly, have a vested interest in learning from knowledgeable people. So number 3 and 4, just reinforcing some of the points I made earlier, is to try, most of the time we think like public health people, but suspend those thoughts, try to think like a journalist, try to think, with your own work, what is relevant and newsworthy about it. So as Varduhi was saying at the very beginning, can you take what you're researching and summarize it succinctly in a sentence or two? And that's really, really hard, because as I was saying a few slides ago, we live in the complexity, and that's part of the research, is making sure that we understand all the nuances of what we're doing. But when you're communicating that to somebody else, they don't care about all the complexity. So can you distill it down to a few points? Can you use non-technical language? Maybe sacrifice some of the complexity to get the big idea across. Remember that sometimes using a personal story is the best way to convey it. And then remember that things like magnitude and impact and surprise are often what makes something newsworthy. Given that we now live in this world where social media is everywhere, don't be afraid to add visuals to what you do, whether it's actual with your publications or in trying to communicate it with other people, either online or if you do end up talking with journalists. I think simple infographics can go a really long way towards conveying messages that stick with people and garner other people's attention. So this is just a brief summary of some of the points that I've gone through, some of the tips. I hope some of these are useful and perhaps demystify the journalist, editor, media mindset. And I just wanted to end, and hopefully we can maybe have a 5 or 10 minute conversation now about how what I've said fits with the Armenian news media context, or with the context in some of your home countries. How do people consume news? How do they consume public health information? Are you happy with the level of media reporting on public health? What do you think gets covered? What do you think doesn't get covered? And also, do people trust the media as a source of health information, or are they more likely to trust what a family member says than what they hear on TV or what they read in print? So, thank you very much, and look forward to hearing your thoughts.
No questions. Oh, you have a question.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. Do you think with media today and the use of social media, is the work of journalists easier or harder? Meaning, if it's so much easier to get news, does that make it easier or harder, or what are your thoughts on that?
It's a good question. I would say almost both, because I think it depends on what you're using social media for and what platform you're using. So I think I've been away for a few years, but I would say most journalists probably find Twitter more useful as a medium than Facebook. I think, at least in the US, but I think this is true globally, people use Twitter to share new information. And so you can actually learn in real time things that are happening elsewhere in the world that would have taken much longer to pick up on before. And there's actually been some really interesting public health research showing that Twitter, if you analyze Twitter, it's been ahead of like the CDC at forecasting outbreaks of infectious disease. And so there's information on Twitter, both in individual reporting and in aggregate form, that becomes available much more quickly. And so I think that can be helpful to journalists. I would say I think Facebook has created a lot of challenges in terms of what is real news and what is fake news, and the burdens on newspapers to try to get their stories shared on Facebook. So Facebook has these very complicated algorithms that prioritize stories, and it used to be people would just go to the New York Times to read. But now the New York Times story is competing through some cryptic algorithm with all these other news outlets out there, in addition to all these robots out there that are producing stories from who knows which country. And I think that's challenging for the industry. So I would say, it depends.
So I would like to know, was there any article or many articles that you wish you haven't published after doing the med school and public school? And what the topic was?
That's a great question. I think there are articles that I would understand much better now than I did. So I'm thinking back to a fair amount of reporting I did about health insurance coverage and insurance companies, and that's really complex. Like, I think the more I learn about insurance, the more I feel I don't understand, right? Like, after going through my master's, there was a point where I was like, I know I'm learning stuff, but I have more and more questions now about how health systems work. And I think when you get into health financing and then you get into insurance coverage, there's so much complexity there. And so I wouldn't say I'm like embarrassed in retrospect about how little I understood, but I do think that's something where now understanding the issue of insurance better, the reporting would be better informed. Hello.
For the wonderful presentation. I'm Damodaran from India, so public health graduate from KVA. So do you think that social media poses an extra burden to public health professionals in a way like it gives easy access to the general public, whereas we public health professional always usually depends on the empirical evidence. But in countries like India, social media has big impact on the general population. So it poses challenges for us to reach the people, to make them aware about certain things such as vaccinations. In India, recently we had a big debate about vaccinations. In social media, there was an evidence-less message that vaccination kills people. So there was a big debate, still it's going on. That vaccination is it is a corporate business. It is going to kill many people. They are using the general people for their experiments. So social media, it plays a major role in providing messages in the wrong way. Let's say it's a big burden for public health. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think personally, I've gone back and forth a lot on this. I think I went through a period of time, particularly when I was reporting and social media was just sort of ramping up 2008, 2009, 2010, when I worried that, I wish social media would just go away, because its power to propagate false information, like you're describing, is huge. And so, it's like a Pandora's box that has now been opened. So I think to some degree, I've had to move away from that thinking because it's not going away, right? Billions of people are connected on social media, and so I almost think the question becomes, well, there are going to be people out there who spread false information on social media, so how do we combat it, and what is our responsibility as public health people to combat it, and what can we do? And I'm not an expert on social media, but I definitely think that there's more that can be done in terms of sharing information from our community, either through infographics, photographs, the things that actually get shared. And some of those will get picked up directly by average people out in the community who are informed by them. Some of them will get picked up by people in the media who will say, this trusted source just put out this infographic saying that vaccines don't kill people, and we should report that. So I hate to characterize it as an arms race, but in a sense maybe it is, that you have a small minority of people out there who are going to spread false information, and so then the burden becomes on the rest of us to try to push back against it. And I don't know if that's the right way to frame it, but I think the alternative would be to try to control the spread of false information, and clearly that debate is happening right now with Facebook and Twitter and other groups. What can they do better to prevent fake news and other just outright lies from being spread, but they're struggling with that piece. And so I feel like maybe we have to do our part in the meantime.
Greetings, thank you for your speech. I'm actually a journalist from a news agency, one of those from your first screenshots. So I just wanted to say that actually everything works exactly the same way as you said here in Armenia. That's exactly how we work. That's exactly how we choose topics, and it was really funny to hear how it's analyzed. So yeah, that's what I
Good. Could I ask you, in terms of public health reporting here, do you feel like it's good? Do you feel like certain stories should get more coverage but don't? It's a bit of a leading question.
Yes, but when we choose topics, we try to pick those that will get our interest. So if there is a choice between two topics, we will choose the one that will be read by more people, not the one that is more important.
Yeah. And if you don't mind me asking, do you feel like that pressure comes from your editors? Because I often, as a reporter, I would sometimes propose stories that would get shot down by editors because they had to think about different concerns than I did, right? They were worried about how many page views was the story getting, how many clicks, how much revenue was being brought in. Whereas I would say, no, this is a good story. It needs to be reported. And there's sometimes that tension between what reporters want to cover and what editors.
It depends on the topic, but that happens sometimes. That's true.
Thank you.
Just to continue some of the points that people here in the audience raised. Recently, I have been thinking why there is so much noise on the introduction of HPV vaccination, false noise. People are worried that these vaccine companies are killing the Armenian gene, etc. And there is no noise about significantly cutting the health budget in Armenia, which means less services. For many people, there is not a noise. But there is a big noise about vaccination issues, unfortunately. But after today's session, it's a bit more clear to me. But I wanted to bring an example of another public health program that was killed in Armenia as a result of big noise, which was on the floor fortification. And I know there are countries where the industry resists, and and they are very open about it. So they tell people that they give lots of money for a negative campaign against. In Armenia, probably there was industry resistance, but not openly. So media was also manipulated, and you mentioned very briefly about like losing the line between information and advertising. Here it was the negative advertising of the event, using either false information or not complete information, like results of individual studies instead of results of systematic reviews, meta-analysis, etc., that should use the basis for evidence-based policymaking. So does that happen, this kind of manipulation? Are you familiar? And what would be your advice? And one more thing, very often public health experts in Armenia don't know how to communicate. So they are very reactive, which I think it creates more negativity. So should they be reactive, or what is a more constructive approach to this kind of situations? Thank you.
Yeah, those are great questions. I mean, I have a couple different thoughts. One is, yes, it has definitely happened in my experience. I remember when I was covering the passage of healthcare reform, the initial plan to pay for it was to adopt a tax on sugary beverages. And it was pretty popular. And polling showed that it enjoyed majority support in the US. And the very powerful corn lobby, agriculture lobby, basically came to Congress and killed it. And so it was an example of something that had popular support and would have had good public health effects, but industry killed it. I think to your question about the use of negative information, that happens all the time. And I remember being bombarded by think tanks, these policy groups in the US that were basically funded by industry, and they would cherry pick data. So they would find studies, take them out of context, put together reports that would claim to serve their point. And it can be very, very hard, one, to know that industry groups are financing those reports, because they often are buried under multiple layers of companies, and it's hard to know who's behind them. But it takes a lot of time as a reporter to go through the data that they're citing and say, is this correct? Like, are they appropriately citing this study, or are they completely misinterpreting it? And so, I guess to answer one of your questions, can we as public health people do a better job of helping reporters, pointing reporters towards good data in the appropriate context and breaking it down and explaining it to them? And maybe that's one way to go about it. That's hard to do. I don't think there's an easy answer to it. I mean, if sometimes as a reporter I would call up other experts and say, I'm reading this study and they're citing these reports. It doesn't make much sense to me. Can you help me explain it? And so maybe it's AUA making members of the faculty available to the media and saying, these are our experts on these topics. They are available for you 24 hours a day, or most days if you want to reach out to them on this topic, and they can help you better understand it. I think that's something I've seen done at a couple universities, where they basically have teams of faculty who are ready to talk to the media and have gone through media training. So there are media training courses you can do where you basically get taught, this is how to speak to a reporter, this is how you take your research and pare it down into a single sentence, but also how to explain things in simple language.
Do you completely ignore the possibility that transnational pharmacological companies can pressure
just to repeat the question, do I agree that pharmaceutical companies put pressure on?
Can make pressure on public opinion, on scientists also, to reject vaccination dangers. Do you believe that dangers, that is not danger? Or do you think that international companies can't make pressure to reject danger?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in my personal reporting, I never experienced that. I would say, coming from California, issues around vaccinations have become very controversial, where there's a small minority of the population that wrongly believes that vaccines are highly dangerous and can cause autism, and these are claims that have been completely refuted, time and time again in the literature. And so I think for us in the public health community, the strongest fight or the strongest argument we have is to draw back upon over the years to show that the overwhelming preponderance of evidence shows that vaccines do much, 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 much more good than harm.
And just to add to that, when you look at the literature research, look at the funding agency. Yes, there are research that are funded by pharmaceutical companies, but at the same time, there is lots of research produced by independent academic institutions that are much more trustworthy. That, of course, and there are policies. Every institution, if they work with industry, they have to accept about it. They have to announce about it. Rarely, sometimes happens that people hide that information, but usually they share this information. And we have a choice, particularly on vaccination studies. We have multiple independent studies demonstrating the risks and benefits of vaccination. But of course, any industry, if they have money, they can lobby, they can spend money to influence public opinion.
So do you know that every vaccine contains poisons? You can't read that.
Oh, okay, that's not true. So let's not go there, particularly those vaccines that are produced currently.
That's the technology. Poisons for technological aims. That poisons must be in vaccine for the sake of technological effectiveness.
Okay, so I disagree with you, but we can continue to have.
So thank you again. Excellent talk. I have a question for you. If you were giving this talk not to a bunch of public health professionals, but to a bunch of journalists, how would you advise them? What take-home points would you give them on how to report on medical or public health issues effectively in an unbiased fashion, prioritizing where the big problems are? And I think that's very relevant to your first question, just a comment to add on with the Armenian news media context, that I think that there is a fair amount of, probably everywhere, as everywhere else, but including the Armenian news media, biased reporting, reporting that tends to sort of fuel suspicions or concerns that the public has, and in general, maybe not in the public health world, but definitely in the clinical and medical perspective, the reporting tends to be very negative and it's not supportive of a lot of the advancements and the improvements that have happened in the healthcare system. So how would you advise journalists on how to report more effectively on public health and medical matters?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I almost wonder if I would go back to this slide and try to get journalists to see things from the public health perspective, which is to say, when you're talking with people from a public health background, you may get frustrated initially that they are talking in a lot of complexity and that they're talking about statistical evidence, and you need to appreciate the level of rigor that's required for the work they do, which explains why they're framing things the way they are. So I think I would start from that point, because I think part of the challenge sometimes is that people are speaking different languages, and so it's sort of a two-way street, that journalists want the public health experts to speak more simply, but the public health experts feel an obligation to, for example, to provide the limitations of their study. And I think that's an obligation that we have in public health, to say, I did this study, I got these results, but don't overgeneralize this, don't take it out of context. There are important caveats here. And so I think that is one thing that I would definitely stress to journalists, that I think when I think about what journalists do wrong covering public health, putting aside what doesn't get covered, if you just look at what does get covered, I think the issues tend to be around either sensationalizing or overgeneralizing, and not providing appropriate context and limitations.
Our time is over. Thank you very much, Ken, for this interesting talk.
Thank you.
Thank you